I'd like to wish a very warm welcome to all the participants in this month's webinar organized by the KFI schools. I'm Alok Mathur, and it is my pleasure and privilege to introduce my friend, colleague, and fellow trustee of the Krishnamurti Foundation, Amresh Kumar. Amresh will be leading this webinar on the place of self-knowledge in education. So I would like to share with you briefly Amresh's background. Amresh first became acquainted with Krishnamurti's work while he was studying physics in college. I believe he was in the Delhi University St. Stephen's College at that time. Subsequently, he pursued his studies in philosophy for a decade, both in India and the US. His interest in Krishnamurti grew alongside, and later he returned to India and joined the Rajghat Besant School, Varanasi, in 1997. In fact, he didn't right away join the school. He actually first applied for or was invited to be part of a fellowship called the Buddha Krishnamurti Fellowship, where it was a comparative study of Buddhism, Buddha's teachings, and Krishnamurti. So he actually came out of his interest in the philosophy to begin with. But I think very soon he found himself getting drawn into the school and became a very active participant in all matters of the school, becoming a house parent, taking on many responsibilities. I think he eventually was a vice principal for a time. And after a few years, he moved to the Sahyadri school, where he worked for over 2 decades. Sahyadri school is near Pune. And for a period of time, he was the principal of Sahyadri school, and he worked closely with all age groups of students there. Amresh's primary interest lies in exploring the teachings of Krishnamurti in their full significance, and more specifically in educational settings, both in school and university. And Amresh has recently, in the month of May, moved to a university setting, and is currently working as the Dean of Students at Ahmedabad University. So that in brief is Amresh's background, and I think we are in for a very interesting presentation by him on the topic of the seminar, which is the place of self-knowledge in education. So I'd like to, at this point, invite Amresh to begin, and I think he has a presentation which he will share and then talk about it. And after, say, around 40 minutes, 45 minutes, once he finishes speaking, we will have time for open question answers. And if you have any questions in the meanwhile which occur to you while he's speaking, you could start putting them in the chat box. And at the end, you're free to again put more questions to the chat box. And I will try and moderate by funneling the questions to Amresh, and he will try and respond to them at that point. So over to you, Amresh. Please, you could begin now.
Thank you, Alok, and good afternoon, everyone. My presentation today, as you've heard, is about the place of self-knowledge in education. I will be using some slides to display quotes from Krishnamurti's works and some of the text from my talk, so you can follow the thread of the discussion. I'll just take a minute to pull up the presentation.
It's clearly visible now, Amresh. Yeah.
Is the presentation visible now?
Yes, yes, fully
Yes.
visible. You could, begin.
Questions I will be discussing all have to do with the role of the educator in holistic education, which is concerned with the flourishing of the child so that she may live a creative, peaceful, and happy life. Although I will use the word child often, I have in mind young human beings from the age of about 10 to 20 or more. And I will use the word school to include the university as well. I will be using gender pronouns like he and she interchangeably. My talk draws on Krishnamurti's educational philosophy But anyone who has a keen interest in education and the holistic development of a child will be able to find meaning in it. Because my invitation to all of you is to listen to what I have to say as a story about human life and its extraordinary possibilities, especially for a child who has been educated rightly. Perhaps you may consider it to be like a painting or a piece of music that evokes responses and moves us to feel deeply about what matters in life, and therefore in our educational work with young people. I want to begin by sharing a feeling that many of us may have as educators and parents about our lives and the state of this world, no matter where we are, the deep sense that we must do everything we can to foster peace and happiness. When we see the impact of the world on the younger generation, the ravages of climate change, the conflicts in Europe and the Middle East, the rise of authoritarian regimes, and the isolating effects of digital technologies, the need to enable our children to live harmoniously without inner and outer conflict is more urgent than ever before. Krishnamurti spoke of the possibility of a profound transformation in human consciousness through self-knowledge. According to this vision, education is not just about acquiring academic knowledge or preparing for a career. The true purpose of schools and universities, or at least what it should be, is to awaken the intelligence of students through self-knowledge, so that they may learn to live without inner and outer conflict. So then, what does it truly mean to be educated to live without conflict? And what role does self-knowledge play in it? To answer this, we must first consider what living without conflict looks like. The essence of life without conflict is beautifully captured in Krishnamurti's analogy of a skilled boatman. Yesterday evening, I saw a boat going up the river at full sail, driven by the west wind. It was a large boat, heavily laden with firewood for the town. The sun was setting, and this boat against the sky was astonishingly beautiful. The boatman was just guiding it. There was no effort, for the wind was doing all the work. Similarly, if each one of us could understand the problem of struggle and conflict, then I think we would be able to live effortlessly, happily, with a smile on our face. The boat, laden with firewood, moves gracefully as the boatman simply guides it, exerting no effort, because the wind is doing all the work. This striking image is a powerful metaphor for life. If we can understand the true nature and source of struggle and conflict, we too can live effortlessly, with ease, contentment, and even joy. What might it mean for educators to instill in children the skills needed for living such a life? Krishnamurti challenges us as educators to learn and teach this essential skill, offering us a path of self-discovery. He tells us, the mind is such an extraordinary thing. You spend 18 or 20 years learning the same subjects and passing several examinations, But you do not spend an hour or even 10 minutes to understand this extraordinary thing called the mind. Without understanding the mind, passing examinations, getting jobs, or you're becoming a minister has very little meaning. It is the mind that creates illusions. And if you do not understand the maker of illusions, your life has little meaning. Krishnamurti's words point to important questions. What is involved in understanding ourselves? What is involved in exploring the workings of the mind, which is the maker of illusions and the source of conflict? And more importantly, how is right education to be imparted, the kind of education that will enable young people to understand themselves? Let's try to address these questions. I would like to explore several aspects of right education, as we've been discussing here, in two sections. In the first section, I'll take up two core elements of self-inquiry that relate to the role of the educator. The first one relates to the inner work that is required for self-inquiry. And the second one is about the place of affection in self-inquiry. After discussing these two elements of self-inquiry for the educator, in the second section, we will explore what the educator can do to nurture self-knowledge in students. It is evident why the educator must engage in self-inquiry. If she is to nurture self-inquiry in her students, she has to learn about it firsthand by doing it herself, then impart it or nurture it in her students. So the first challenge for the educator relates to the inner work required for self-inquiry. Before an educator can help students cultivate self-knowledge, they must first be aware of their own inclinations. This can be hard work and requires actively engaging with questions about one's own habits of thought and feeling, grappling with oneself in examining one's motives, reactions, and tendencies, asking oneself in all earnestness what right relationship may mean, what it means to live a balanced life, and so on. Krishnamurti says that there is indeed hard work to be done in understanding what peace is and what happiness is. To understand what peace is requires a great deal of intelligence and hard work, not merely sitting down and wishing for peace. Similarly, happiness requires immense understanding, insight, and hard work. As much hard work as you give to earning a livelihood, and far more. There is another aspect of self-inquiry that can seem hard because it can cause moral distress at a personal level if one is honest. Krishnamurti points out, true relationship is really a state in which you are constantly in a process of understanding yourself in relation to something. That is, relationship is a process of self-revelation. And that self-revelation is very painful because in relationship, you soon find yourself out if you are open to discover it. So this is the work to be done in self-inquiry, engaging with questions about one's own habits, motives, thoughts, and actions, observing oneself in relationship, and facing oneself in the mirror of self-inquiry. And then one may find something more deeply existential, something that Krishnamurti often returns to, which is one's loneliness. It is relevant and important for the educator to face his loneliness because it is part of his life journey, and indeed all of ours. It is important for him to make contact with this aspect of his inner life and begin to discover what it means to be free of its inner compulsions and feelings. Doing so will equip the educator with a sensibility and a language to meet the student's questions about his own loneliness and self-isolation, not uncommon in childhood and adolescence. In the process of exploring loneliness, one may find that the root of loneliness lies much deeper in some unconscious fear, not in the easily recognizable conscious fears. And so, as one treads this ground of self-inquiry, it is relevant to ask how one might make contact with unconscious fear. Krishnamurti suggests that we can understand our unconscious fears and find release from it through affection. In the unconscious, there is fear, and to understand it, not consciously, you can't understand anything deliberately. You must come to it sensitively, with a freshness, with an eagerness, with an intensity. That is, you must come to it with affection, with love. Then only you will understand something. This is the second element of self-inquiry I had mentioned earlier about the place of affection in self-inquiry. I think that when we speak of the art of living, the art of listening, or the art of observation, the freshness, the eagerness, and the intensity of affection are rather important. Perhaps genuine affection is essential in self-inquiry. Without genuine affection, one's journey into self-knowledge may remain at the level of the intellect, marked by ignorance of one's deeper conditioning, untested by the challenges of self-revelation in relationship, and trapped in the self-deception of an unconscious hypocrisy. Affection is also important because when it is genuine, I feel it is an inseparable part of humility. Affection without humility may be a form of attachment, a mask for one's vanity. And humility without affection may be a pretense, a form of self-deception, and another form of vanity. The humility of genuine affection seems to be essential to the art of observing oneself without distortion, without which self-knowledge may not be possible. We come now to the second section of my talk, in which we will explore the approach to be taken in nurturing self-knowledge in students. To do this, let me pause and try to answer three questions. First, who is the child? Second, what stance must we adopt in relating with the child? And finally, how can we nurture the process of self-inquiry in the child within the setting of a school? To explore the psychological makeup of the child or the young adult who comes to school or university, let me create a word portrait of the child in four different aspects: her innate qualities and natural inclinations, her family background, her life as a teenager, and the influence of contemporary factors. Let's consider first the innate qualities of the child. There is curiosity, spontaneity, affection for others, empathy, interest in learning, play, forgiveness, listening without judgment or prejudice because of their innocence, feeling strongly and experiencing a passion for things, perhaps more pronounced in teenagers, the need for security, and the need for autonomy. Then there's the background of the child, which includes beliefs and attitudes towards various kinds of people, of class, caste, religion, and so on. And there's social morality, which includes a relationship to authority, obedience, adopting role models, the idea that being good is important, being successful, the idea that the purpose of life is to grow up to be happy and successful by finding your place in society. Growing up, finding one's place in the peer group, discovering who you are, sexuality and sexual identity, romantic attachment, intellectual development, entering into the world of the disciplines, negotiating schedules and relationships, the need for sleep, risk-taking behavior, rebelliousness, and cynicism. And finally, contemporary influences and factors, addiction to electronic gadgets and social media, isolation, and the vast onset of anxiety, depression, and self-harm, which has escalated alarmingly over the last 2 decades or so. Interestingly, there's been some research indicating that risk-taking behavior appears to have reduced over the same time period. And then there's moral despair at the state of the world. This then is the child who is with us, inherently curious and inwardly alive, capable of spontaneity, responsive to the world around her, but also conditioned by social morality, weighed down somewhat, roughly between the ages of 12 and 17, by hormonal changes and the challenges of growing up. And finally, increasingly encumbered by emerging technologies that compete to capture more and more of our attention. Every child is different, but the educator must be aware of these factors in our word portrait and understand their interrelationships so that he is better equipped to relate with a particular child. Let's take up the second question now. What stance must we adopt in relating with the child? Let me use an analogy to open up this question. When the potter throws the clay on the potter's wheel, he must first center it in order to do his work gracefully. It is not enough to have the clay. He must create the right conditions first before he can do his work. In a similar way, the educator must first adopt the right stance towards the child by relating with him, by treating him first as a human being, complex though he may be. One of the obstacles to adopting the right stance towards the child is our tendency to dominate. Let me spend some time talking about this tendency to dominate before proceeding to discuss what the right stance might look like. Krishnamurti has often lamented this tendency to dominate. Unfortunately, he says, most of us desire to shape the child in a way that is gratifying to our own vanities and idiosyncrasies. We find varying degrees of comfort and satisfaction in exclusive ownership and domination. Surely this process is not relationship, but mere imposition. And it is therefore essential to understand the difficult and complex desire to dominate. It takes many subtle forms, and in its self-righteous aspect, it is very obstinate. The desire to serve with the unconscious longing to dominate is difficult to understand. This unconscious desire to dominate can often express itself through the expectation of obedience enforced by the authority that adults hold over children. Yet obedience stands in direct opposition to inquiry, as it conditions the mind to fear and insecurity. A child must become a light unto herself. And this fundamental inward orientation is thwarted in environments where authority rules. This obviously doesn't mean doing away with rules or reasonable expectations for behavior. However, when an educator becomes fixated on enforcing order and compliance, a culture of obedience emerges, shutting down any real opportunity for inquiry. Why is authority so undesirable? Because genuine inquiry thrives in an atmosphere of relationship, not control. When children fear the adult, they lose the curiosity and the seriousness needed to truly explore themselves and the world. This is why Krishnamurti has often said that the child must feel absolutely secure at home and in school. There is another kind of domination which is more subtle and therefore requires a keener self-awareness on the part of the educator. The mindset of obedience can be cultivated simply by using words that evoke feelings of status, condemnation, or approval. The use of such words prevents the seeing of things as they are by reinforcing the unconscious habit of associating feelings with words. Any sensitive educator, therefore, realizes that judgments aimed even indirectly at children through the use of words that control their feelings are detrimental to the awakening of their intelligence. This is what Krishnamurti has said about how words can create a barrier to self-knowledge. Watch your own responses, and you will see that words like lawyer, businessman, governor, servant, love, God have a strange effect on your nerves as well as on your mind. The word which denotes a particular function evokes the feeling of status. So the first thing is to be free of this unconscious habit of associating certain feelings with certain words, is it not? Your mind has been conditioned to think that the term selfish represents something very wrong, unspiritual, and the moment you apply that term to anything, your mind condemns it. In essence, then, educators must develop a profound sensitivity to how their own tendencies, especially the desire to dominate, can thwart the process of self-inquiry in children from a very early age. In meeting the child in this whole endeavor to rightly educate him, Krishnamurti has always been emphatic that we discover what it means to understand the child as a whole. He says, to understand a child, we have to watch him at play, study him in his different moods. We cannot project upon him our own prejudices, hopes, and fears, or mold him to fit the pattern of our desires. If we are constantly judging the child according to our personal likes and dislikes, we are bound to create barriers and hindrances in our relationship with him and in his relationships with the world. Every child is unique, and taken as a whole, it is impossible to measure him as a human being or to compare him with other children. In school, however, there is a constant stream of evaluation of the child's academic performance as well as his general behavior in the light of school expectations and norms. This is obviously relevant. Krishnamurti is simple and direct about the need for such evaluations and the need for conformity at this level, but only in this superficial sense, not in the deeper aspect of our existence as human beings. He says, conformity, adjustment, adaptability superficially is necessary, but inwardly, deeply, conformity brings about effort and therefore imitation. And so it is crucial for the educator to understand where the evaluative stance is necessary and where it must be dropped. When the educator relates to the child as a non-fragmented, total human being, he enters into a non-evaluative stance. This is what Krishnamurti says about what I'm calling the non-evaluative stance. The ability to observe without evaluating is the highest form of intelligence. I think it is one of the greatest challenges in a school to inculcate among teachers this non-evaluative stance, as well as the capacity to swiftly switch between the two stances, the evaluative and the non-evaluative. Let me for a moment hark back to the skilled boatman in my first quote from Krishnamurti. It seems to me that the skilled educator who can swiftly switch between the evaluative stance and the non-evaluative stance is able to effortlessly and without conflict guide the student, like the skilled boatman who was just guiding the boat effortlessly, without conflict with the wind and the waters of the river. Stemming from the non-evaluative stance is another critical dimension to this capacity of the educator in understanding the child. This concerns the educator's capacity for what I'm going to call, for the purpose of our discussion here, moral imagination. What do I mean by moral imagination? It involves being able to construct ways of looking at the child so as not to fall into any kind of evaluative judgment, but to make sense of his speech and behavior in the light of who he is as a growing individual and as a human being. This is an immense challenge, but also one of the greatest joys of being an educator. It seems to me that most educational shortcomings arise because of the poverty of the educator's moral imagination, which results in their incapacity to truly understand the child. I must add that the application of one's moral imagination seems to remain always somewhat elusive, even for experienced educators, because it really demands the involvement of the whole of one's being, intellectual capacity, a childlike playfulness, and an empathic interest in the child and his flourishing. Yet, if kept at the heart of the educator's intent, it is profoundly enriching and liberating for the educator. The use of moral imagination, which stems from the non-evaluative stance, is essential in school if we wish to nurture self-knowledge in the child. By the way, all of this also applies to the parent's relationship with the child at home. Can anything else be done to actively nurture self-knowledge in the school? The answer is yes, but the field is vast and many-layered. Krishnamurti schools have adopted several practices to nudge the child to slow down, to be quiet and remain unoccupied for a few minutes in the day, and to reflect on their life experiences. I would like to explore here one aspect of self-knowledge in the collective setting of the school, which is the capacity to look and listen without distortion, to see things as they are without judgment or prejudice. As children grow older, their somewhat dormant social conditioning, as well as their memories of personal experience, begin to hold sway. This can come in the way of their listening to others without distortion. Can this quality of listening without distortion be inculcated in the child. It can, or a beginning can be made, if there is a sense of urgency in the school's culture to nurture this capacity through conversation and dialogue, individually and in small groups. The values and skills demonstrated in such interactions can considerably deepen the capacity to listen without distortion, without judgment or prejudice. Listening without judgment or prejudice may appear to be a matter of the head, a matter of the intellect. After all, judgment and prejudice originate in thought, though feelings may accompany them. But for Krishnamurti, there is a much deeper quality of attention that goes beyond intellectual discernment and the absence of bias. And that has to do with what he has described as a look of love. You look without the look of the observer. You look without the value of the word and the measurement of yesterday. The look of love is different from the look of thought. The one leads in a direction where thought cannot follow, and the other leads to separation, conflict, and sorrow. The look of love is different from the look of thought. I think children know the look of love naturally, instinctively. The way they feel the joyous urgency to go out and play, or the way they are moved by another's pain, or the way they forget their hurt and forgive the one who caused that hurt without even knowing or realizing that they have forgiven or forgotten. It is an important part of nurturing the child, not only to enable the look of love to flourish, to have its natural existence and its myriad forms of expression, but also to plant the seeds of valuing this look of love. Based on numerous conversations with students in small groups over the years, I feel that it is when the head and the heart function together that there is the possibility of serious inquiry. Only then might there be a depth in the asking of a question and the gentle, self-aware resilience of pursuing an inquiry far enough. Krishnamurti seems to take it even farther. He says, the quality of seriousness is to pursue to the very end of thought, an idea, a feeling, to go to the very end of it, not to be dissuaded by any other factor, to inquire into every thought, to the very end of it, whatever may happen to you. The resilience, the quality of seriousness, and the capacity for undertaking the hard work needed for self-knowledge, all of these are outcomes of right education, which concerns itself fundamentally with the awakening of the student's intelligence. These capacities are cultivated through the honing of the relevant skills, as well as a steadiness of the head and the heart, which can be nurtured through immersion in a school culture where the work is already happening. A vibrant culture of conversation marked by listening, drawing out those who hesitate to speak, listening to those who do, honoring those who speak from a place of vulnerability, and an abiding sense of goodwill are some of the essential ingredients in a school culture that aspires to nurture self-knowledge. A child who has been rightly educated in such a school and has pursued this inquiry independently in her own life may then be able to live in a wholly different way, free of inner and outer conflict. Thank you.
Thank you, Amresh, for that very slowly, clearly, well-articulated exposition of the topic. It's a very complex and subtle topic, and I'm quite moved by the way you have drawn the threads together and developed it in a certain, coherent kind of a manner. I think, and though we are speaking about children and schools, but I suppose all these principles that you've talked about apply to any human being living life in this world. To live life with a certain sense of absence of conflict, a certain sense of ease, which is an extremely hard thing to do in today's world. And of course, I think the intention is that if we can start young, and if people who are older can start along with the young, then that would make, some difference. Those little drops which can add volume to a different way of life, possibly in this very, very challenging world. So thank you very much for sharing uh, your reflections on this topic. And I now invite from those who are participating, as listeners, you've all listened carefully, I hope, and you have maybe questions brewing in your head about this topic. I already have two or three which are on the chat box, and I will maybe begin by posing them to you, Amresh.
Sure.
Yeah. In fact, I think the questions really, a lot of them come really about the relationship between the teacher and the student, or the adult and the child. Questions are linked with that. So one,
Yes.
I would, I would not necessarily go in the order in which the questions have been posed, but maybe one question which could do with a little more elaboration, which Vijay Anand Bhagvatullah is requesting. Can you please elaborate further on the evaluative stance and the non-evaluative stance? And I think once you do that, the other two questions will, I think, also, be easier to respond to.
Yeah, so it's a good question, and I think it is always worth returning to in our work as parents, in our roles as parents and as educators. I think the evaluative stance is something we adopt to measure knowledge and skills, sometimes attitudes, even values, and if the interest in any given situation is to calibrate and measure, then there's some sort of a benchmark. You may, let's say, use a marking system to evaluate the performance of a student in a subject. And that's what I'm calling the evaluative stance. Within a school setting, within educational settings, if you look at the world, in almost everywhere, there is a process of measurement that is underway, isn't it? You need that. Students need it on their report cards. You need it in your resumes to apply for jobs. It's built into the whole system as it functions. And I think the question that is being asked by Krishnamurti, so a question worth asking for all of us, is what is the nature of that relationship, the relationship between this evaluative system and the life of the human being? What is the nature of the human being? And how do these demands that are placed on the human being through this process of evaluation, how does that cohere with the human being's nature, right? And if your objective in education is the human beings flourishing, then it's important to ask if the evaluative stance or the evaluation systems have an impact on the child which is diminishing, which creates obstacles in that flourishing. We know how it does that. It creates fear. There is so much comparison. And so the mind of the child, when it hasn't reflected on these matters, and if the adult has not encouraged an examination of the evaluation processes and a close look at the psychology of the child's responding to these evaluation processes, then the child is left with fear and guilt. And if you talk to students, as many educators would in school and in university as well, there is a lot that is happening in their inner lives. There is a consequence of missed opportunities to engage with questions of the kind that you're asking. What does evaluation do? What is its purpose? Is an evaluation of my skill or my knowledge or some capacity really a measure of who I am? And to work with that question, to stay with that question for a while so that it can be explored. The non-evaluative stance, I think, comes into its full expression, if you like, if the educator has an understanding of the limitations or the limits of the evaluation process. You understand that that is required. Examinations have to be taken. Somebody or the other around you is going to make an assessment of your skills because they have to figure out whether you're going to fit into a job for which you're applying. And those are at one level of our existence. But if the environment around the child, especially when they're in the younger years, allows for no room for another way of looking at the child's being, then that's the only look that is available to the child. And all his being is reduced to that framework, the evaluative framework and the evaluative look. So I may be in a class, for example, just to stay with this for a couple more minutes. A teacher who may be entirely or largely concerned about my performance in the exams or is interested primarily in my engagement with the academic content, may have one kind of relationship with the student. If an educator is also interested in how the student is learning, what is it that they have experienced after they have received some sort of an evaluation, then the intent of such an educator from this non-evaluative stance has a much wider scope, because you're not judging the child. You're engaging with the child in questions about their experience in the world that they are living in. So I think it's a very fundamental difference in intent that I try to capture with those two phrases. The evaluative stance comes with that limitation. It's implicit in the way I was using it, that there isn't an interest in typically in asking questions and engaging with the child in the larger sense. And so I said, if in a school setting where there is an awareness about nurturing self-knowledge and engaging with the student in a deeper sense, a skilled educator would be able to switch quickly. So you've made an evaluation because there is a process. Maybe you have shared a certain procedure and in class, you've read a story or solved a problem and you've given feedback to the student in the context of that exercise, because you've talked about learning a particular skill. And there is a process of evaluation that happens there in making an assessment, receiving feedback, measuring how far you've traveled, what you can do to improve in those skills, and so on. And that's a process of evaluation. But then the educator has to be self-aware and not fall into a judgment about the child. And that's a label that can come in unless I'm also inviting the child into a conversation about labels. And so what's happening to you as you are going through all this? Are you really learning? Are you learning about physics, which is what we are doing in the class? But let's also learn about the fear that you are experiencing. Are you experiencing some fear? Let's talk about that. Because the fear is as important as the physics. And so then you have a larger understanding of the human being. And only then would you be interested in finding out what is it that the student is going through. And in relating with the student and asking good questions, then direct the student's attention to an awareness of the background, of the psychological arena that surrounds the engagement with physics, which is, let's say, the subject matter. I don't know if I have sort of meandered around this distinction between the evaluative and the non-evaluative stance, but I think it is of fundamental importance in really connecting with the humanity of the human being that the child is. And education tends to really reduce the engagement of the educator and the student in sort of very compartmentalized ways. And there are constraints. We are not being just naive about these things. I think there are very real constraints of time. And if you want to, let's say in the university especially, you have to cover a certain amount of ground. And then you have to find other ways of bringing in this, what I'm calling the non-evaluative stance, and encouraging a wider conversation about learning and about the experiences of the student. It's easier in the school setting, but I think it's also quite important even as students grow into university. You look around at the college level and talk to young people, and there are lots and lots of questions that are there. And one of the responses I've had is to such conversations is, what missed opportunities? Here's a young person who has wonderful questions. And if you trace the journey of that human being through home and school and now in university, they've done a great deal, but it's as if the parts of them that could have grown in wisdom and capacity and humanity, in meeting complex situations in their lives, and grow into a sense of confidence and affection and the capacity to relate with life situations, all of those things seem rather diminished. And you have a young person who has a certain capacity, but not a lightness of tread, and a sense that we live in a complex world, but I think I have understood something of tremendous value. So I think I should stop. There
are more questions coming in. Thank you, Amresh, for elaborating on this question, because it was I think it's one of those questions which really, I think, is the razor's edge of your talk. It's really part of the educator's self-inquiry, that are you slipping into an evaluative stance every now and then, even when you don't need to. And I think the other thing you said about words can dominate. So just the way you say something, the way you communicate after a so-called evaluation, which is meant for learning, it can turn it in a different direction. So this need for self-awareness in the educator is a very crucial thing here. So let's move to another question. I think I'll take some of the early questions. Mr. Ashok Korwar, he has two questions, in fact. Is it a good idea to ask the child to create a self-image about herself as part of self-awareness?
Hi, Ashok. Yes, that's a good question. I think that I've grappled with this kind of question earlier, I recall. I wonder if I would say yes to your question. I'm not sure that I would like to say that it'll be good for the child to develop a self-image or to encourage it as part of the process of arriving at self-knowledge. So there are a couple of things I could say in response. One is, I think that I wouldn't say it shouldn't be done. That if there's somebody who wishes to engage in, let's say, journaling and write to create a whole narrative of who they are, a very richly detailed narrative. I can see if, depending on what your phrase self-image refers to, if it is rich, if it is nuanced, it's full of insight, then it might be interesting, I think, in this area of self-inquiry. I think the problem is not so much with the self-image, but the manner in which one relates with that image. So if I can have a self-image, but also an attitude of questioning about it. I mean, there is this distinction between the growth mindset and the fixed mindset that you might be familiar with from work that has come out of Stanford. And it's relevant for learning. So if you have a certain mindset about yourself and it's provisional and there are good questions attached to it, then I would say that the kind of thing you were saying might be quite interesting. Develop this kind of a self-image. I'm using the word self-image with some flexibility of meaning to enlarge the scope of this discussion. And the other one would be where it's narrowly held. I have an image of myself as socially awkward, or I think I have poor self-esteem, or I think I think I'm not the kind of person who makes friends very well, and that's like a stereotype. It's not really that richly developed and nuanced self-image that I was just trying to outline a little earlier. And here, the problem is that it's not flexible, it's not dynamic, and there's no learning happening there. That being said, I think there's another way in which I think having some sort of an understanding of what you are experiencing, especially if the experience is complex in one's inner life, I think it might be useful because, there is this phenomenon. You might be suffering from anxiety and you have no awareness of that. Yeah, you hold stress in the body and you have no understanding of that. And it's slowly doing whatever, the biochemistry of it is doing something in the body. So in such a case, it's good to have a label so that cognitively you have some sort of a toehold on a somewhat complex area of inner life. And then you might explore further and investigate. It's moving from blindness to some kind of seeing. And then you might proceed to ask other questions and learn something about that aspect of your inner life where you have been blind, let's say, so far. And in that case, there's some sort of labeling of some part of your inner life that can be enabling. I think Krishnamurti has talked about it in somewhere. I can't remember exactly what it is, but I think he says this. If I wish I had the quote, I could access it. But he does talk about bringing a certain kind of almost verbal or cognitive recognition of what it is that you're feeling, and then moving beyond that. So maybe in that case, if I'm not misrepresenting Krishnamurti, it might be relevant to have some form of labeling before you move beyond, as your understanding deepens, your insight matures.
As long as you don't get stuck with that label.
As long as you don't get stuck.
See yourself as someone who's changing, dynamic, complex, and not be held within those words. Yeah. There are several questions now coming up, Amresh. So I'm going to try and bat them to you.
Sure.
And I'm not going in order. I'm just taking level of complexity of the question. So sometimes there's a conflict. This is Jigisha Patel who asks. Sometimes there's a conflict the child faces where the values and morals they align with, but it is different among their peers, and sometimes they feel left out or forced to adapt to them just to be part of it. How do we deal with this as parents or educators? It's a very real question, I think, parents and educators face. So she asked, I hope my question is clear. I think it's quite clear.
Yeah. Yes, this is all around us, isn't it? I think we just had a circle of conversation yesterday in the university, and this was one of the central themes that emerged. Um, so I think that there is little that I see myself being able to do directly for a young person who's facing that, because it's already part of their reality. I can be available as a listener, a sympathetic listener, a friend, a mentor, and so on, an older person who might be available for, some friendly support, things like that. But I think that the conflict is the end result of a longer process. And if there is a pull in different directions, whether it is in terms of moral values, if you like, or other kinds of choices that the student may make, or in terms of their orientation broadly. There are kinds of orientations that individual young people have that are in conflict with society in various ways. Sexual orientation is one of them. But also somebody who's not wearing clothes that there are no branded shoes that I'm wearing, and you go into an environment where everybody is rather affluent, and you might just be shut out. So there's conflict of that kind, and at the root of it is, I think, this the sense that the child could have had of not measuring themselves vis-a-vis um, this yardstick of some kind, appearance, moral choices, and so on. And if you were to trace back and look at the earlier journey of that person who's now a young adult or an older student in high school, and think of what has happened to them when they were at the age of 3 or 4 or 6 or 7, I think the seeds might be planted there. Just join me in this thinking. I'm not saying that I know the whole thing, but I think that it is in that journey that there may have been opportunities for the child to awaken to a way of living where judgment doesn't take root in the soil of their mind. Just consider that possibility, to have an engagement with their daily life where they don't encounter judgment and uh, therefore not experience the need to measure their sense of inner wellness, if you like, or sense of things being all right vis-a-vis what is happening in their environment, because nobody is asking them to do that. The problem, I think, is that when the child has to encounter fear or rejection, or is locked into the need for an approval from a moral authority figure around them at an earlier age, that's hard for the child to undo, because then fear has crept in. It's true for all of us. I mean, this is not to presume that I'm speaking and I'm completely free of this, but let's consider what the educational story is, and what is it that we can learn from our account of the relationships that we've had with children as they've grown up. This will have relevance even for relationships amongst adults if you were to really go into it, but let's not go in that direction. If we stay with that story of what happens to the child who's 3 years old and 4 years old, it's being determined for that child on an hour-to-hour basis, because the child is trying to do something and then it receives feedback from the parent or some other caregiver or some teacher to behave in a certain way. Otherwise, there is disapproval. Okay? Now,
So
that
Ashish,
sets,
you're saying that the roots are early, and many of us have those roots perhaps.
of course,
But now you're in this situation. Suppose the parent is a little more enlightened now, and you see your child in that kind of a conflict, and you're aware that
yes.
these roots are there, and they're there in you also. Would it
Right.
be possible still to undo that, open it up, maybe as you've said, adapt superficially and yet not, you know, uh, Also, it boils down to maybe that deep loneliness that everyone might feel at some point.
Absolutely. So I think that in going along in the direction I was headed that way. But the point is that it is not just about telling the child.
Yeah.
You see, it wasn't about telling the child when she was 3 years old. It was being with them in a certain way. You had to relate with them. You can't be solving that particular problem, is what I would like to say. It's not problem solving that's what's needed in human relationship and in the flourishing of this kind. It's about engaging with them so that they might open up to the experience of suffering that they're having, and that they learn what to do with that. And that's not going to happen if we immediately try to solve a problem. And as a parent, I would probably rush to do that myself. I'd be with you in that sort of impulse. But I've also learned as a parent to become aware that that's an impulse that's working, and to build that muscle of restraint to pull back and allow for a different kind of space to develop. And then the conversation meanders into interesting ways where there is an insight, a question that the child herself will formulate. Having experienced a problem and having had a certain listening ear, in 20 minutes, the child herself arrives at a fresh view of something. And so in this case, it's more the art of listening and drawing out that may have been instrumental, rather than offering a solution or trying to reconcile one picture with another.
I think that's very helpful. Yeah. Can I pose another question to you now?
Yes.
The short pause. There are several actually. So let me just pick this one, which is a very basic question. I think, how do we ignite or improve the quality of listening without distortion? This is from Mr. Nagarjuna Kunduru. He has, I think, some other comment also later on question, but let's take this one. And you did refer to it in the passing in your talk. Maybe you could just elaborate on this.
Yeah, this is a challenging one, and as far as I have explored this, but it is also one of the most beautiful ones. So it is a little bit like what we were just Alok and I were discussing and uncovering. I think a process of examining how we are thinking, what's involved in that, so that the reflection in some ways is a negative one. You initiate a process of reflecting on the thought process that is underway, maybe expressed as a question. And instead of proceeding to develop that thought and leaving the hidden assumptions unexamined, to engage in that. I'm afraid I'm not going to be able to give you a nice sort of answer. But I think this needs to be explored. It's a good question to work with, and then to understand what are the different kinds of ways in which listening and seeing without distortion, as you say, can be ignited. I think I have seen this happen in small conversations where somebody is making a judgment about another person because something has happened, and that judgment is strongly colored by perhaps their situational hurt that they have experienced a few hours ago. And in the listening and the speaking and the staying with that emotion and the associated thought and the memory of what has taken place, if the educator himself or herself is not trapped in any one of those judging processes, in many cases, the child will sense that. And in a few cases, might even have that insight about what they are doing, and tap into their own capacity for undistorted listening, which may already exist. Except that in this situation, they are overwhelmed with hurt. And so if you speak and listen as a dispassionate or a sensitive, keen listener to what is being said, but what's behind those thoughts as well. And that's a capacity that grows to listen behind the thought, especially in relationship. Every conversation may be different, but you can, in delaying your own responses as an educator, one can learn a great deal by becoming more delicately sensitive and aware of where the student may be coming from. And in that quality of listening, then the student may begin to see the possibility of an undistorted listening.
I think that's
It's indirect,
very,
isn't
very
it?
nicely put what you said at the end. That the first thing is, can the educator bring that quality? And be aware of when he or she is not doing it, and then be aware of that and then bring it. And that can be sensed by a child. And, over time, if this is experienced in different ways, children can begin to see that there is a great value in this. Not to very quickly react and make assumptions, judge things, but to slow down and be attentive. Yeah.
So there is a small extension I can make to this, which is that in all of these questions, I think it is worth considering that in all of these questions, when we ask about the child, there is a corresponding question that is applicable to me.
Yeah.
And it's always, I would say, always wise to consider whether that's a more important question to start with. It may not be, but it's wise to consider that possibility and then keep learning about, what's a good starting point or an entry point. When there's a crisis, then you have to help the child. Okay, you've got to jump in and do what you can. But often our anxieties, our worries, our expectations, because we may be a teacher and I'm answerable to somebody else and it's hanging on my shoulders and I haven't sorted it out as a person. So all that worry is behind me, and I'm moving on in a certain conversational mode with the student. And it's a lesson for me to learn to exercise restraint, because I notice that's what I'm doing. But in that act, I have done something that is of value to me. And then indirectly, it is a student who will notice a difference. There's that statement, isn't it? You teach what you are, not what you say. And I think in this sense, it is to the extent that you have a certain quality of undistorted listening, then that's the thing that will communicate itself. It's not so much talking about listening without distortion, but also engaging in that act, whether you speak about it directly or not.
Also clearly related to what you've been talking about, the non-evaluative stance or the look of love, all of those, I think, factors.
Yes.
Alive
Yeah.
in you relating with the child, and those things in some way begin to seep in.
Right.
I
think to just add to that, I think that children do have, in my experience, limited as it is, I have very, very often been surprised, not because it was unexpected, but just delighted, I should say, by the possibility, by the situation where a student moves, right? They're not stuck. There may be a hurt, but they have moved. And it's quite remarkable. If you are also engaging with them from this other place where you're not rushing into to solve the problem of that child's hurt. If you're not rushing in to do that, not that you are insensitive or cruel, you might be an empathetic listener. And be present while the child suffers through whatever they are suffering. But you notice that students may draw into their own beings, because when you speak of the fixed and the growth or the flexible mindsets, children have that innately because they are at play so much. And of course, gradually, there is no way in which this journey can be videographed. The inner story can be videographed. We can't see the details. But as the children proceed to grow up, maybe around grade 7, 8, 12, 13, something happens there, right? And then they become more, move in the direction of social identity and their equations with each other, and moral thinking becomes more prominent. And because it is often not the subject matter in schools directly. It's not, we have something called the culture class in Krishnamurti schools, which is a remarkable space, but it's a very small amount of time in a week. But if the curriculum were to be flipped, I mean, it's not going to happen. But consider that students were really supposed to live a life so that they really flourished deeply, and they could do physics 5 years later. Then they would tap into this energy. They would, out of their own interest and engagement with things that they cared about, they would come alive to it, and they would live like that. And so it's a challenge, I think, for students to come to a point where they feel that they're not as agile as they used to be, inwardly agile. And so but the educational opportunity exists right through. They may encounter somebody a little later, a friend, a mentor, or parent who has, gone through some sort of a transformative process, and they turn around, and a child like that may be engaged, may find a different kind of engagement, and um, move forward.
Since there are only less than 10 minutes now, can I pose at least two more questions to you, Amresh? And will you be able
Yes.
to? Yeah. So one, I think it's a different register, this question. As a parent of a school, one of the KFI schools, I struggle with how much access to technology should be provided to a child while on vacation. I find myself trying to be restrictive, but I want to try and understand the right balance of allowing access and providing boundaries without superimposing my ego on the child's experience of the world. So how would one respond to this? Is a very real question in today's technology-driven world.
Yeah. I think it's a very big challenge, and I don't know if I can shed a lot of light in a way that you will feel enabled in your understanding, because it's very complex. Students live in a society of theirs. Their peers all inhabit that culture. It's very strong. I mean, I don't even know what is happening. Not a lot of what is happening in that culture, but a lot of it is driven by digital technologies, whether it's Instagram or what have you. And if you're not a participant, a particular child may actually be facing very real issues. So, but arising out of this reflection, I would probably, if I were in those shoes, I would find ways of having a conversation with my child, to be in touch. I would go along with your reflection that you would not like to impose something on the child. I think I would align with that. But I would then take on the challenge, and I think it will be a challenge, to educate myself about the ways in which I can play an enabling role with my child by joining her and understanding her experiences. She's going through something, and if I understand what she's going through and understand the kinds of what she conceptualizes as problems for herself that she'd like to solve, because she's a free agent in her world. Okay, she's a free agent in her world. It's a fact. We can't debate that. And if I join her in taking a view of what she sees are her problems, then I'll actually enable her to arrive at her insights. If she's living in unbalanced, she's using technology in an unbalanced way, then she knows it because she's suffering from it. She's not getting enough sleep. So part of it would be just giving her perspective or some knowledge about how some of her engagements are adversely affecting her own life and a sense of well-being. And then she might come around and say, look, I'd really like to explore this because I see this clearly. So when I think this is just a specific instance of a more general conversation, which is that if I want to engage with a student, my role as an educator is to figure out what is the problem that that person wants to solve, and to understand that. And that itself is a very big challenge. It is not for me to simply jump in and try to solve her problem. As a parent, I might need to do that often. But in this case, it would be a challenge for me as a parent to really educate myself. I'll have to allot time in my day. Literally, I have done this to some extent, to really study it for a while. Because as a parent, I have no clue about her world and what's happening there. And so you get involved, you study it, you formulate your own thoughts about it. You find out what would be a good way to have a conversation about this so that it doesn't generate conflict. And then you learn about it as a parent. I should stop.
Last question, maybe it's a slight follow-on question at a broader level. This whole process of, it's an anonymous person, nurturing the child, ways in which you explain to awaken the intelligence of the child. What are the important things that the teachers and the adults, that includes the parents, need to keep in mind so that the child will not become emotionally dependent? I would also add, or emotionally reactive to the adult who is trying to awaken intelligence.
Right. No, there's no trying to awaken intelligence, I feel.
Yeah.
that would be,
What
that wouldn't
is it
work.
that the adult should keep in mind? I think it was
Yeah.
added through your talk, but maybe you could just draw those last nuances in the next 2 or 3 minutes.
I think that the place from which one's clarity would emerge is in the investigation of that question for myself. I need to take that seriously for myself. If whatever it is that I understand by that phrase, awakening of intelligence, if I found something that is of meaning, because somebody has spoken about it, somebody who has made a journey in life has said, look, I've traveled 10 miles into the desert and I have a story to tell. Would you be interested? And suppose you find that interesting, then you would have to make that journey, and not, I couldn't just take a part of the account of that 10-mile walk into the desert, if you allow me to stay with that metaphor for a while, and just then go on and tell the next person, why don't you go ahead? That's doesn't help, because I haven't really engaged with the journey itself. The journey is rich, and my merely telling the child to go ahead and make the journey is insufficient. It's like I might tell a child, take a simpler example, leave the awakening of intelligence. I would like my child to read at home. The best way to do it is to start reading myself. Because it matters, I think. I think in the moral fabric of our lives, I can't not be doing something and then just speak about it to another person. One could analyze that and so on. But I think apart from that moral fabric element, it's just a sense of the child being drawn empathically to what is already happening. Because what's happening there is rich. And the child is interested in the richness, because he's a human being. He already has that innately in him. There is no, inevitability. You might, as a parent, go very far and the child might not respond. But if there is a right way of moving forward, it would be for oneself to embark on that journey in understanding what it means for the intelligence to be awakened, and then out of that, relate with the child.
Thank you so much, Amresh, for responding to all the questions at length and at depth. In fact, there are many people who have really appreciated the whole presentation and your responses to the questions, including the parent who asked about technology. And people want to know whether this can be The presentation can be shared through email. I will leave that to Siddharth or Aishwarya to respond to the presentation. And will the talk be available later on online for people who might want to hear it again?
Yes, it will be available. I've typed in the chat the email ID with which you can get in touch in case you would like the recording.
Okay.
Just KFIHQ at kfi.com.
Thanks, Siddharth. And thank you very much for all of you who've participated and asked, questions that have drawn much more out. I always find that the interactive part of such a session really brings alive the topic, which was, explained in a very nice, cogent kind of a way. But this really brings out the complexities of it very well. And thank you so much, Amresh, for, doing this for us.
Thank you, Alok. Thank you, everybody.
So I think we will now bring the session to a close. Thank you, Aishwarya, for managing the whole thing. And thanks, Siddharth, for organizing it.
Thank you all. Thank you,
you.
Amresh, Alok, and Aishwarya.
So we may now exit if we wish to. And just copy out all the questions which were not. I could not. I'll send them to you separately on the So
yes, that will be very nice. Thank you.
Okay. I think everyone's leaving one by one, and so have a nice evening, Amresh, Siddharth, Aishwarya.
Okay. Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.